Joan Biskupic is, of course, with us this evening to talk about her new book. She's here to talk about her new book, The Chief, which examines the life and times of the most pivotal figure on the Supreme Court at the moment, Chief Justice John Roberts. As a journalist, Joan has been covering the Supreme Court and legal affairs for 30 years. First for Congressional Quarterly, then the Washington Post, USA Today, and Reuters. And nowadays, she serves as a legal analyst full-time for CNN. Her experience, knowledge, fairness, and insight have shown not only in her journalism over the years, her journalism about the Supreme Court, but also in the well-received biographies she's written about some of the court's members, including before Roberts, Sandra Day O'Connor, Antonin Scalia, and Sonia Sotomayor. Roberts, Joan has said, proved to be her toughest subject so far. Even after 14 years on the court, he remains somewhat challenging to figure out, opaque and enigmatic to many. Yet for all his affable demeanor and relatively low public profile, low by Washington standards, there shouldn't be any doubt just how influential and powerful John Roberts is. As Joan notes in her prologue, while there have been 45 presidents of the United States, there have been only 17 Chief Justices. And with the retirement last year of Anthony Kennedy and the confirmation to replace him of the more conservative Brett Kavanaugh, Roberts now exercises even greater control over the court and is being looked to as the potential swing vote on key cases. In writing her book, Joan had the benefit of extensive interviews with many of Roberts' friends, family, and colleagues and former classmates, as well as a number of off-the-record talks with Roberts himself. And the portrait she presents is revealing and enlightening about the development of Roberts' career and his judicial philosophy. She does a great job laying out the conflicting pull on Roberts from his two main priorities. On the one hand, his commitment to maintaining the court's image as an impartial institution, and on the other, his devotion to long-held and fixed conservative views evident in decisions on such issues as the Voting Rights Act, campaign financing, the death penalty, abortion rights, and workers' rights. But in the final analysis, does Joan's biography offer much hope for those who are looking to Roberts to moderate the court's turn to the right, as he famously did in that 2012 decision upholding the Affordable Care Act? Well, I encourage everyone to read Joan's insightful and clearly written book and make up your own mind. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Joan Biskupic.
Thanks, Brad. And can everybody hear me? Thank you for coming here. And as many of you know, Brad was a colleague of mine. And as I look out in the audience, it's like every part of my life is represented here, including people who are at the gym early in the morning at 5 a.m., who meet me at the gym, people from law school, people from everywhere. And dear old friends. So thank you all for being here. And I want to start tonight with a letter that I reproduce in the book that I think will give you an immediate sense of my subject. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the backstory of the narrative I created, so you get a sense of that. I won't talk initially about the Affordable Care Act and his decisions on race, because I know those are areas that you'll have questions on. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what isn't as evident when you read it. First of all, the book opens with a letter that he wrote on December 22nd, 1968. He's just 13 years old, and he's writing to a man by the name of James Moore, who's the school headmaster at a place called La Lumiere, where he wants to attend boarding school. Dear Mr. Moore, the main reason I would like to attend La Lumiere School is to get a better education. I've always wanted to stay ahead of the crowd, and I feel that the competition at La Lumiere will force me to work as hard as I can. At an ordinary high school, it would be probably easy to stay ahead. I realize that going to La Lumiere will be a lot of study and hard work, but I feel confident that these labors will pay off in large amounts when it comes time to apply for admission to college. I'm sure that by attending and doing my best at La Lumiere, I will assure myself a fine future. I won't be content to get a good job by getting a good education. I want to get the best job by getting the best education. Sincerely yours, John Roberts Jr. And what I loved about that letter that I found at La Lumiere under glass at the high school that I went to visit is that those themes repeat themselves throughout his life. And I will come back to that in the end, but I just wanted to give you a more personal feel for my subject. My book devotes a two full chapters to his early formative years, and then one to his vote switches in the Affordable Care Act case, where I found he switched not once but twice, his positions on race, and his current conflicts at the center of the court with Anthony Kennedy's retirement. And as I said, I expect to get questions on those. So I want to focus instead right away, just to give you a little bit of feel about the narrative I created and the shifts I had to take when I was writing this book because of what was happening at the Supreme Court. So much of the material in this book comes from interviews that I was conducting all along when I worked on the Antonin Scalia book that came out in 2009 and the Sonia Sotomayor political history that came out in 2014. But it was really in 2015 that I began in earnest on this book and began crafting my proposal. And at the time, Justice Scalia was alive and Justice Kennedy was in control. And I was trying to figure out what sorts of moments in Chief Justice Roberts' life could sort of launch the book and be illustrative. And one episode that I found early in my reporting that I decided I wanted to use for the prologue actually occurred at a moment that I was in the courtroom. I'm going to bring you back briefly to that. It's January 21st, 2015. I'm thinking about John Roberts. I'm pretty sure I want to use him as my next subject. I'm sitting there. I'm working for Reuters at the time, and I'm ready to write an analysis of the case that's being argued. It's a Fair Housing Act case. Suddenly, there's pandemonium. Demonstrators in the audience start shouting, "Money out of politics, reverse Citizens United." It was the 5-year anniversary of the court's decision in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, and the activists were protesting that, which everyone knows had rolled back federal regulations on corporation and labor union expenditures and campaigns. And these protesters, sitting out like that, were working in sequence. One would pop up, and then the officers would wrestle him or her to the ground, then another would pop up. And it was really disconcerting, and it's sort of amazing that the court and people like me weren't more prepared for that kind of a demonstration on the 5-year anniversary. As many of you know, the spectators are expected to maintain such quiet and follow the strictest decorum at the court, no cell phones or electronic devices. So there's just such a sense of quiet and predictability. And suddenly, these people who were associated with the grassroots group 99 Rise, a reference to the 99%, were there demonstrating. The Chief Justice is very disturbed, and that's what got my attention, because I was, at this moment in the Chief's life, I was thinking about his efforts at control on the law, and I thought this is going to be a great metaphor. So during this episode, he can barely conceal his anger as the protesters are being muscled out of the courtroom. And he says in a very angry voice, "We will now continue with our tradition of having open court at the Supreme Court." And I talked afterward to his colleagues, and they said what was so disarming about this moment is no one knew how many people were out there, how many people were ready to protest. And again, for purposes of a Roberts biography, I thought, this episode is going to be a great metaphor of his trying to maintain control, and I'm going to open my book with this. So I begin writing this, exploring the tensions at the court, and I get through 2005, and I'm early in 2016, and my book proposal is accepted. And suddenly, on February 13th, 2016, the entire court world is turned upside down, and so were my prospects about how to treat John Roberts. That was the night that Justice Antonin Scalia is found dead at a remote Texas ranch. And it looked like, at least in the beginning, Chief Justice Roberts was going to lose control of his conservative majority for the first time in his tenure. The chief would be outnumbered by liberals because, of course, we all thought President Barack Obama would be appointing his successor. So I thought, okay, this is my new prologue. So I decide that I'm going to track down where every single justice was in that moment, because I'm sure many people in this room remember where they were that night. I certainly do, when we all got word that Justice Scalia had died and how the court might be transformed. Now, with the chief, though, it was not easy. For those of you who know the Supreme Court, you just can't call up and say, hey, exactly where was the chief that night and how did he respond? You know, they don't want to tell you anything, mostly for security reasons. They don't like to say where the justices are. But I initially found out that he was in Florida. So I knew pretty quickly that he was in Florida. I didn't know exactly why he was in Florida, but I started nosing around about that. And in the meantime, I was also looking at where all the other justices were that night. You know, through my contacts with folks, I was able to find out that Justice Ginsburg was getting ready for the opera at the Kennedy Center that night. Justice Kagan was going to accompany her, but she had stopped at the Supreme Court early to do some work. Justice Thomas was reading briefs at his home in rural Virginia, and I found out exactly what former clerks he had called right away about that. I was able to find out which justices found out from court personnel about it and which had to learn from TV and were kind of angry about that. You know, so I get all this information, and all I can find out about the chief is that he is in Miami. And now the court was in a 4-week recess at the time, and it was likely that maybe he had gone down for a vacation. But, you know, these justices just don't go on a vacation. They usually go to speak, or they go to, they do something, they almost always do something that's in conjunction with another event, you know, like teaching a class, giving an award to somebody, being part of a judicial conference. So I'm nosing around about that. I'm also, you know, since we're all in Northwest DC, I'm also looking up he has 2 children, one who was at boarding school at the time and one who was here at a girls' private school, and I was kind of checking that schedule. Were they on spring break? Was there, you know, like I'm thinking, you know, this is what you do. You try to find out stuff. You try to figure out what was it and who might have been at the scene when he got this news. So I kind of set that aside, but I'm thinking, this is how I want to start this book. I want to start with this really big moment. So I kind of just set that aside, knowing that I will find out, because I always do. So I go about my other research and interviews, and you know, as I said, I wasn't worried about it. And I start finding out about his old people who had been with him at La Lumiere, the prep school, and people who had been with him at Harvard. And then I start talking to individuals who had judicial clerkships at the same time he did. And along the way, I decided to follow up with a man by the name of Dean Colson, who was John Roberts, was a law clerk to then Associate Justice William Rehnquist in the 1980-81 term. And that was really an important thing for me to plumb, because the current chief is very much like the past chief in terms of his ideology. And that was his John Roberts' first experience at the Marble Palace, so to speak. And I wanted to find out what that was all about. So I tracked down Dean Colson. A lot of people tell me that he was still in touch with him. And I find out that Dean lives in Coral Gables. He practices law down there. And I call him, and I'm mainly asking him to recall the time period of 1980 and 81 when Roberts and he were together. And I wanted to know, what was he like? What did you think when you first met him? And he says, you know, he looked so young, but I knew that he had, you know, been a star at Harvard, and they had a law clerkship with Judge Henry Friendly on the Second Circuit. And we're talking all about that. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of the conversation, I think, Coral Gables, Miami. And what also triggered that is I said, you know, do you still see him? And he says to me, oh yeah, I see him regularly. You know, they like to tell you that. And I just ask outright, so what was it like the night that he found out that Scalia died? I just asked that. And Dean says to me, it was stunning. Everything came to a stop. He was in shock. It was unbelievable. And then in the back of my mind, I think, this is definitely my prologue. So So, this court-altering, life-altering moment, I now have this other piece. So I find out that, John Roberts had gone down there. It was during the long President's Day weekend. I find out that his wife Jane had been with him. Josie, the daughter, had been with him. John, the son, Jack, was up in boarding school. So I've got the whole scene. I find out that they played golf. I don't find out exactly how he did, but it wouldn't have mattered because I wouldn't have known. So now I've got it. So I'm all set, and I have this nicely reported moment of where everybody is, and this is going to be really important in this book. But of course, the theme of this moment of John Roberts losing his court in that moment shifts. But that's okay. I can accommodate that. Merrick Garland doesn't get his hearing. Donald Trump wins. A potential setback to John Roberts is reversed. He suddenly has his court back, and I think that's okay. This is still a great opening. And so we get to April of 2018, and that's when the lead time with books is so long that's when I had to submit my manuscript. So of course, nothing much else had changed by April of 2018, and I have that, and I'm thinking, okay, this is gonna be good. And I was one of the people who thought Justice Kennedy probably does not want to give up the power he has. And I kept thinking, okay, I know he's not feeling well. I know he's had some rocky times, but he can hang in there, And I'm also thinking, I cannot handle another major thing I have to accommodate in this book. But as we all know, on June 27th, 2018, Justice Kennedy retired. And at this point in the publishing scheme, and I know many of you in this room have been working on books or know the business well enough to know that, you just cannot keep adding. And at one point, my publisher even said, "This is not a newspaper. Stop calling us with new information. Stop doing this." And I'm like, but just a little, this keeps happening. So I think, okay, I can weave in toward the end the news about Kennedy leaving. I can work in, the final rulings. I can keep doing that. And I'm dealing with that. I'm obviously working a full-time job. I'm trying to cover the end of the term. The big Trump versus Hawaii case has come down. I'm, obviously trying to figure out who might President Trump name to succeed Anthony Kennedy. And it's this huge balancing act that I'm engaged in just as my book is going into production. And I'm having concerns about that prologue. I'm thinking, oh, it was so carefully reported, but do I want to begin this book with something that happened in 2016, and people will be reading this in March 2019, and Kennedy's retirement was so big? So fortunately, I had been able to talk to several justices right after Kennedy's retirement and find out what had happened behind the scenes. So I had a nice chronology to work in at the end of the book, which is where I was essentially able to make changes. And, we know Brett Kavanaugh was nominated, and we get to July. That's in July, and I'm moving into August. And, the book is getting deep into copy editing and production. And I'm able to make some changes. I should mention, this will give you an indication of how much I kept wanting to make changes. Even when I got the copy edited version, when I got the galleys back, 400-page book, I made changes on 200 pages. I was just so, and the production editor, I thought that woman's, there were 3 different production editors, but it just goes to show how much you're trying to accommodate, not both in terms of news, but then also your own efforts to get it as much right as possible. But I'm still thinking, okay, I can live with that prologue with the chief in Miami. But a friend of mine, this is where you're trying to suppress your concerns, and what you need is some good advice. And a friend of mine who's a law professor down in Texas, who had read a portion of it, said, you've got all this information about Kennedy now you're weaving it throughout. But it just seems to me that you need to do more with that, because the court is transformed now. It's just transformed in a way that you can't just say that, you have to show that more. And I'm thinking, he's right. And meanwhile, the publisher's like, don't even call anymore. Do not even call us. Don't even try. But now by this point, we're to August. And, I'm reading Brett Kavanaugh opinions. I'm juggling all this. And I happened to have a meeting. I went to see a justice who I talked to. I talked to most of them throughout all this book. But this one particular justice who I really appreciated guidance from, and who had talked to me about Kennedy's departure, I start laying out exactly how I had structured the book. because I just wanted to say, oh, this is what I ended up with. And as I am describing the prologue, I just blurt out, I can't open the book this way. I finished up my conversation at the court. I went back to my office. I sent my publisher a note that said, I'm changing the prologue, like, see me later. I am changing this prologue. And I did two things that I thought would soften the blow of my saying this. One, I said, I can do it within 48 hours. And here's what I know. And I thought, I could lay out what I had gotten. The fact that most of the justices took the bench that morning at 10 a.m. and did not know he would be leaving, and did not know when they left the bench that morning that he would be leaving, because they announced this big ruling in the labor union case that many of you know, the Janus ruling, where they're tightly divided 5-4. Justice Alito announces it. Justice Kagan gives this fiery dissent from the bench. We don't even hear Justice Kennedy's voice at all. His wife, Mary Kennedy, and some grandchildren are in the courtroom, and some of us think, oh, maybe he's about to announce, and he doesn't. They all go back into their private conference, and that's when he tells them. That's when he tells them, after they go through some business that they had to mop up, he tells his colleagues, and most of them were thunderstruck. They just did not see it coming. It's kind of like a lot of people who thought, oh, but he could be. He's about to turn 82. He could be leaving, but a lot of people were in denial. So I sketched that out. I sketch out how Kennedy's colleagues offered him hugs and handshakes, and then they went off for a private luncheon, and Justice Kennedy leaves early because he gets driven over to the White House so he could tell President Trump in person, and I find out that it's the chief's top assistant who drives him. The chief doesn't go, but I have all this color. So when I sent my note saying, I'm changing this. And then I also said, I do not think we'll need to change the page count. That's another thing that, they don't want to, I'm trying to offer reassurances, and I don't even know what the reaction was in New York, but I got it changed. But then I have to figure out, how do I go from that opening that you'll see when you read the book back to my transition to the Scalia death? Because even though I was going to pare that down and I was going to leave out a lot, I just did not want to abandon it completely. So this is how I handled it. I write, the turn of events that late June morning represented a dramatic reversal from what had appeared to be Roberts' fate only 2 years earlier, after a separate startling occurrence. At that point, Roberts could have assumed that he and the other conservative justices would be in the minority on the court for the foreseeable future. The news that had come that February recess of 2016 and reverberated for many months, the news had come that February recess and reverberated for many months. It was a Saturday of the President's Day weekend, and Roberts had been playing golf and relaxing with a friend in Miami. And then I told a little bit about what had happened. And then after I unspool that, the next thing that you see in this book is that letter. And then I go into tell the tale of this very fortunate life of a very fortunate man who, as a boy, always wanted to stay ahead of the crowd, and who didn't want just a good job. He wanted the best job. So I hope you enjoy the book. So I think they have two microphones. Oh, okay.
Hi.
Hi.
The blurb for this lecture mentioned that Roberts has protected the image of the court. Do you feel that he's also protected the authority of the court? And how do the image and authority relate?
That's an excellent question, because I think that's the question that is constantly weighing on him. He has said that as a Chief Justice, he probably doesn't vote exactly as he would have if he was an Associate Justice. As Chief, the court informally has his name, but he's also very concerned that the court doesn't give out money, the court doesn't have an army, the court only has its stature and its authority. So we've seen that throughout his entire 14-year tenure, and I think many of us saw it in his rebuke of President Trump recently, when he said, we don't have Obama judges, we don't have Trump judges, responding to President Trump's line about, an Obama judge was the one who ruled against me. So I think he's constantly weighing that, and that is a very strong priority of his. And I think he has been effective. I think that a lot of people have a lot of respect for him, and the lower court judges have respect for him. Thank you.
I always have to start to say that I'm not from the United States. I'm from the Caribbean.
Okay.
And I say that because, I mean, when you come from different places, you have often different points of view. And I grew up in the Netherlands. I went to law school in the Netherlands, University of Utrecht Law School. So it's not as if I do not know quite a bit about this. But there are some questions that I think are quite troubling to me about Roberts. Roberts, certainly after Rehnquist, after Berger. I mean, the Supreme Court has been under kind of right-wing domination now for a significant amount of time, right? Arthur Schlesinger talked about the fact that the United States would spin 30 years left, 30 years right? The Supreme Court is not spinning, in a ways. But be that as it may. Some more problematical questions. How do you see a Supreme Court that remains with Roberts quite right-wing and quite conservative, while you have a population shift in the United States of America, a democratic shift, I mean a demographic shift, right? The population is becoming majority minority. And to a large extent, not completely, but to a large extent, that population that is coming, I think are much more in favor of a kind of living constitution type of interpretation of the Constitution for all type of different reasons, right? I would believe that Roberts would be much more into the Scalia model of a kind of, although with his, with the Obamacare type of thing, he kind of, to a certain extent, breaks out of that. How do you see all of these stresses on him, interpretive stresses, historical stresses, the stresses of keeping the Supreme Court legitimate, right? As you know, there's a growing. How do you see these things playing out over time?
Okay, great. Thank you for your question. And that gives me a bit of a jumping off point to talk about his attitude toward accommodating diversity in America and racial remedies, and where he is very consistent on the right as opposed to someone who might be working more the middle. And I would say that his idea of race in America and diversity in America is that everyone is better off if he or she is not classified by race or ethnicity. He's famously said the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. He believes that any kind of racial classifications and remedies are debilitating. They actually do more harm than good. And this is an area where he has been incredibly consistent, both in the law as a justice, but also in terms of all his work in Washington. Patterns of his work with the Reagan administration, where he held jobs right out of his judicial clerkships, emerged in memos that some of you might remember from his 2005 confirmation hearing, when he wanted a narrower review of the Voting Rights Act, in part because he felt it was important for the states and localities to have more control there. And in terms of racial remedies like campus affirmative action, he has always felt that this is something that the equality guarantee of the Constitution would forbid. And he has been consistent throughout in that way. But yet, as you talk about his idea of trying to straddle the middle, I think we'll see that in other areas. I have said that I don't see him inching. I see him inching toward the left in maybe First Amendment cases, in federalism cases, but on race and religion, I think those are two areas, and it's yet to be seen on abortion rights if he will compromise in that way. Thank you. Go ahead.
The very day the Affordable Care decision was made, a Republican friend called me up and asked me if Roberts was a social justice Catholic. And I said to him, the only thing I know about is that I think that La Lumiere is kind of a finishing school for Catholics. And you can comment on that. But what's your take on these two end-of-life cases that have just come before the Supreme Court, where it looks like they reversed themselves completely just yesterday about accepting a case from a guy in Texas who wanted a Buddhist to accompany him to his execution, changing completely what they did just a couple weeks ago.
Right. Okay. So there are like three different things that you're asking about here, all that I think are important to raise. One was, why did he do what he did in the Affordable Care Act case? what was La Lumiere really like, and I'll tell you real quick. It was a school that many people would be familiar with. It wasn't a finishing school. It was very rigorous, had to learn Latin and Greek, and it was a tough 4-year elite, highly academic school that he took advantage of intensely, graduated first in his class, and was the first La Lumiere graduate to go to Harvard, which he finished in 3 years for undergrad. So he did very well. He did, and he learned a lot at that school. Then I'll address the Affordable Care Act, and then I'll just do as a footnote the it's a death penalty issue that he asked about in the end about a convicted condemned inmate, whether he can have the first case that the justices rejected was an inmate who wanted to have a Muslim, a Muslim minister with him, and the court said no. And then just last night they allowed a Buddhist monk to be on hand, and the court doesn't explain itself. And there was a suggestion that they were saying, oh, the timing was different, but they got the justices. That was a 5-4 vote to allow the first execution to go forward. And Elena Kagan wrote about how unfair that was in terms of religious rights for that one, and that probably stung those in the majority. But let me just address your core question about his votes in the Affordable Care Act case. Bring everybody back to 2012. It's an election year. President Barack Obama's signature domestic achievement is before the Republican-led Supreme Court. Everybody's wondering, will these justices strike it down on a 5-4 ideological, even political vote? And indeed, what happened in their private conference at the end of those 3 days of oral argument was a vote to strike it down. John Roberts voted to strike down that law based on Congress saying that Congress had exceeded its intercommerce power, its power to regulate interstate commerce. He started to have second thoughts, though, because the other conservatives who were with him, again, it was 5-4, wanted to strike down the entire law. And we're all familiar with everything else that was in that law. You know, the things that we remember from, insurance companies couldn't cut you off for pre-existing conditions. Children could stay on your insurance policies until they were 26. The Medicaid expansion was in there, all sorts of provisions. And once the justices had voted to strike down what everybody referred to as the individual mandate, the insurance requirement, 4 of the conservatives wanted the whole thing to go. Same time, I do want to mention there was another vote taken that never got much attention at the time, but they had voted to uphold the Medicaid expansion. That was another major plank of that law that, the federal program where states are given money to help people who are at the poverty line. The Obamacare had expanded the number of people who could qualify for this. So the original vote is to uphold Medicaid but strike down the individual mandate. And the chief starts having second thoughts. He doesn't want the whole thing he doesn't want what his conservative brethren want to have happen. And through a series of negotiations over several weeks, he switches his vote to decide that he can uphold the individual mandate, but not on commerce power. He can uphold it on taxing power, as most of you remember. And then he also switches his vote to then strike down the Medicaid expansion. And as he's doing this, the 4 other conservatives, Justices Thomas, Alito, then Scalia, and Kennedy, are really angry that he's doing it. They're dug in. And on the left wing, Justices Sotomayor and Ginsburg, they're dug in, but Justices Breyer and Kagan start dealing with him and to make sure that if he's about to switch and uphold a central provision of this landmark law, they want him with him. They want to keep him, and things were very much in flux. So they end up changing their votes on the Medicaid expansion, kind of giving him a little bit of cover there. And at the time, there was Jan Crawford of CBS News had written a story about how other conservatives were very angry with Roberts and what appeared to be a switched vote. And no one else had picked it up at the time, but I talked to a majority of the justices, and I had gotten hints about that, but only in my reporting for this book did I find out about the Medicaid flip vote, which I couldn't believe. So that was an important thing for me to understand about the chief. And what I take from that is something that I think is instructive for today's court, is that He will not always just be looking at, the umpire role of calling balls and strikes and just looking at, the black letter of the law. He might look for ways to accommodate what's happening in America and not want the court to look as politically charged as the tensions out there. And, he obviously had been a lawyer who represented insurance and the medical industry, so he understood those tensions there, and he just did not want to put out a decision that was 5-4, the conservatives striking down Barack Obama's law.
They still look at the election returns.
Thank you. Yes.
There's been considerable speculation as to the timing of Justice Kennedy's retirement and how his son's career, which seemingly is tied in with Donald Trump, may have affected that. Can you give us any insight into that at all?
Okay, so what the questioner is referring to is the fact that President Trump's family and sons, did some dealings with the Kennedy sons. They were up in business up in New York, and there was lots of rumors about whether some deal had been made to encourage Justice Kennedy to leave at this time during the Trump administration, and not just as sort of some kind of deal involving the son's work, but also maybe to guarantee that one of his former clerks, Brett Kavanaugh, got named to that seat. I am sure lots of conversations went on between Justice Kennedy and then White House counsel Don McGahn. I know that happened. But I also know that Justice Kennedy's health didn't seem great at the time. I mean, he's okay, but he had some setbacks, as did his wife, Mary. And he had been talking about retiring for a while. And I can believe a conspiracy theory as much as the next person, and I think that certainly he might have been wooed a little bit by the Trump administration, maybe given some confidence that someone who he believed would be of his thinking, someone who he respected, a former clerk like Brett Kavanaugh might be named. But I also think that he just personally in his household with his wife thought the time was right. So that's where I end up. Thank you. Yes.
I wanted to get some thoughts from you on Citizens United, and I guess the tack that I'd like to take is one of consistency, since you've mentioned consistency a few times. It was clearly, though, a case where this tension between wanting the court to seem impartial and wanting to do what he wanted to do. I guess the question is, do you, kind of in light of how that case is looked at as just going forward in time, really, really important. Do you think he's had any change of mind about the main issues of Citizens United? The basic issue of, is a corporation a person as far as the Constitution is concerned?
Right. Now, I actually don't think the chief has had second thoughts about the Citizens United ruling. His idea on the First Amendment, well, first of all, the court has long said that money is speech, and his idea is that the more speech, therefore the more money, the better, and that both sides are able to put in money to campaigns. And he assigned that opinion in 2010 to Justice Kennedy, who had long felt that precedent in this area should be reversed. So this is something Kennedy had been pushing for. But then the chief wrote a separate opinion to sort of counter the view that you're articulating here about,
Right.
geez, runaway, corporate spending, and also concern about politics of the court. And he, to essentially say this has nothing to do with politics, this has to do with the First Amendment. And just recently, the chief gave a speech at Belmont Law School down in Nashville, where he claimed the mantle of being the justice who is most in favor of a broad, robust ruling of the First Amendment. And I'm sure he was thinking of campaign finance rulings as well as other First Amendment free speech cases. Right. Yeah, he doesn't strike me as a man who has regrets, especially on something like that. Mm-hmm. He was very angry, as some of you probably remember, right after the ruling when President Obama, during the State of the Union address that January of 2010, complained about it. He was so angry that a few weeks later, the chief is talking at the University of Alabama, saying how awful it was that there they were, kind of just sitting ducks in front of in this chamber of,
Right.
raucous applause. But I have never heard him go backward on that. And in fact, just the opposite. He was the author in a case, I think it was in 2015, when he took it even further in terms of
Right.
lifting campaign finance rules.
Well, maybe that Obama incident strengthened his resolve.
Yes. His resolve is always strengthened. Thank you.
Oh,
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sorry.
I'm curious if you have a sense of who or what has influenced Chief Justice Roberts, and if there is any particular chief that he admires most of his predecessors.
That's a great question, and that's a question that I asked people all along. Who, mother, father, mother, you're always trying to get inside the head of one of your subjects, and who was it, who really moved him. And he talks a lot about Judge Henry Friendly, who he clerked for on the Second Circuit, kind of an intellectual judge who had a wonderful reputation for, he was conservative, he leaned that way, but he was seen not as a conservative in the ideological sense that we have today, but again, just a highly regarded, respected judge. I think John Roberts wanted to be identified with much more than he wanted to be identified with William Rehnquist, kind of in that world. So that's one person. His parents, he has his father's name, John Glover Roberts Jr. His father was an influence. And then to your question about chief justices, he teaches a course on chief justices when he goes off for his summer jaunts, and he's always respected Chief Justice Hughes, in part because of how Hughes handled Roosevelt's court packing threat in the 30s. So he has spoken about him that way. His line about how he wants to be remembered in history is, you're certainly not going to be thought of as John Marshall, the great writer of Marbury versus Madison, but you also don't want to be considered like Roger Taney, who wrote Dred Scott.
May I just ask, is there any justice to whom he is particularly attached the way he was to Kennedy on the current court?
No, I think Elena Kagan would like him to be a little more attached in that direction, because she has obviously tried to work with him when they had only both Elena Kagan and Stephen Breyer were quite helpful when the court was just at 8 to try to bring about compromise and work with the chief. But no, there's no one. I can't think of a natural pairing like we had with Scalia and Ginsburg. It's just not that kind of place anymore.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hi, Joan. I've followed your career since USA Today, when I figured out you were a Beverly Morgan Park Biskupic. And I have admired your ability to sort of take this beat and own it. Has there any time during these 30 years you ever thought about writing about something else? And if so, how did you knock that notion out and stay the course?
Well, that's a good question. And when she refers to Beverly Morgan Park, South Side of Chicago, is where it's something that has identified me in my life more than just about anything else. But there's a woman in this audience who I'm not going to point to, but she once asked me a similar question, saying, if you could write about anybody, who would you really write about? And I said, I'd write about somebody at the court. No. If you could really write about anybody, like if you could write about, and I think a lot of people think, wouldn't you write about, Elizabeth McGovern of Downton Abbey, who I actually saw, right? Judy Woodruff interviewed me the other night, but the first person she interviewed before me was Elizabeth McGovern. And I was like, wow. So like in the back of my mind, I think maybe Elizabeth McGovern? No, but I actually don't. I really enjoy writing about the justices, in part because there's such a mystery to everyone here. And, I'm running out of interesting ones, I have to say. So it's getting a little bit tough, but I'm already thinking about what I want to do next, although I don't like to say it out loud with my husband in the audience, because it's like, please don't tell me you're going to do another book. But it's kind of like, it's what I love to do. And to me, it's the chase. I mean, that whole thing about finding out where the chief was that night and who he talked to and what he said, or, I really enjoy that. Although a lot of people like the political campaign more, and I don't write, at least now, maybe during the next 30 years. Something different. But anyway, thanks for the question. Yes.
I'm kind of short, sorry. Before I ask my question, I'm just going to say you answered my prayer by writing a book about Chief Justice Roberts. I've been waiting for this book because Lisa Tucker McElroy wrote a children's book about him,
Oh,
and I
right.
was basically just like learning about him based on like the pictures and stuff. So thank you for that. And if you need any recommendations, Justice Breyer, to me personally, is really interesting because of international law and the fact that he's a
Yes, he is.
Francophile.
Yes, yeah.
Would love to see how you would take or interview him about his like influences with international law. But my question is regarding Supreme Court ethics and the possible ethics code. So Justice Alito, along with Justice Kagan, testified before the House of Representatives for Supreme Court budget, and they mentioned that Chief Justice Roberts is probably thinking about drafting a Supreme Court ethics code. To me, I think this is the first time the Chief Justice role may be having some sort of teeth, because he's typically just symbolic first amongst equals. So I'm thinking, so what my question is how do you think he might exercise that power? And do you think if he drafts a Supreme Court ethics code, that could solidify his role as one of the great Chief Justices to come?
Okay, that's a question about refers to the fact that right now there's a federal code that covers all lower court judges in terms of their ethical behavior, and when somebody is the subject of a complaint, the process of how that goes up through judges. Now, let me just say, it is still judges policing their own. And the Supreme Court says that it abides by it in spirit, if not the letter of the law. And the thing that I wonder about is, if he writes a code, how will it be really different? How will it be different, and who will police that? Who will care? I mean, we all remember when Justice Scalia went duck hunting with Dick Cheney, when Dick Cheney had a case before the justices, and you know, Justice Scalia felt that it wasn't important for him to recuse because it wasn't a case against Dick Cheney in his personal capacity, and Justice Scalia wrote this great letter or order explaining why he wasn't going to recuse, saying, you know, if we can't have friends who are in high places, what's the world coming to? And, you know, Byron White was friends with the Kennedys and all this. And it was a great letter. Essentially, we stick to our own. What's the problem here? But, you know, but, you know, frankly, in that case, Justice Scalia was probably going to rule the way he was going to rule no matter what, having to do with Dick Cheney. But even if there's a code for the justices, which would reinforce what they say they already do, the question is, would it be overseen by anybody other than the court? And actually, that does what the justices say is that would create, if anybody else was overseeing it, it could create separation of powers problems. Mm-hmm. But I think for the chief to at least acknowledge that it's something that might be necessary to inspire more confidence in the court, that would be a good thing. But I was in the room when Elena Kagan said that at the budget hearing, and all she said was, it was like one sentence. She said, the chief is thinking about a proposal that would extend the ethics to the Supreme Court, but he hasn't told others about it yet. So, and then I went up to the Supreme Court spokeswoman and I said, what's that all about? We don't know. You know, like, so, and we haven't heard anything yet. So, you know, I have a feeling he will follow through with something because he knows it's become quite controversial. Thanks.
So looking ahead a little bit, how do you think Chief Justice Roberts might change or not change if he is the Chief Justice of a court that is 6-3 conservative, or in the next iteration remains a 5-4 court, the way we ordinarily discuss it? Yeah,
I think the more conservative this court gets, likely the more to the left he'll tilt. I actually think, and again, not on race, religion, some of the culture wars issues that are important to him and his conservative roots, but I think that the more President Trump acts like this court is in his pocket, the more John Roberts is going to want to show that it's not. I think it's important for him institutionally, and I think what he'll do is, in a practical vein, try to get his colleagues to rule as narrowly as possible, avoid big sweeping statements, so that the court can appear to be a different kind of entity. From his very first months in office as chief, he had a message that he was repeating early on, that he still is repeating. if the American public's going to know anything about us, we're not like them. We don't come in as Republicans. We don't come in as Democrats. We are trying to be impartial. We don't want to be identified by the president who appointed any of us. And I think that if he's saying that, he has to at least, like show that also. One more?
If I could revisit the ethics code
Sure.
of conduct, do you not feel that was motivated by the charge against Brett Kavanaugh at the appeals court, which was dismissed because he was no longer an appeals court judge, and therefore, since there was no ethics code at the Supreme Court, there was no violation of any ethics?
No, that's exactly right. But I would take it as a partnership to what had even happened, all the attention called to this during the Alex Kaczynski matter. As many of you probably know, the Washington Post had broken the story in December of 2017 about Alex Kaczynski, a judge on the Ninth Circuit, who had been the subject of complaints about sexual harassment of clerks and other staffers in his office. And he got out from under those complaints when he stepped down from the bench, because the way the ethics code is written now for all judges, I mean, first of all, the Supreme Court's exempt, but for all judges, if you retire, they just drop the investigation and you get your full pension. So that the whole ethics wars has been in the air. And then what this gentleman is referring to is Brett Kavanaugh was subject of scores of complaints, not from his confirmation hearings, some even before Christine Blasey Ford testified, some that were lodged about some of his statements that he made about his rulings on the D.C. Circuit and some of the things he said, and then more came in after the sexual assault claims. And those went to the D.C. Circuit, which is where he was sitting as a appeals court judge before his appointment, and they sent him up to the Chief Justice saying, we can't resolve these because he's from our court, and the chief sends him to the Denver-based 10th Circuit. But even as the chief did that, we knew what was going to happen because they're not covered. And I remember writing about that, and I was talking to people at the Supreme Court saying, why, you're causing people to presume something's going to happen here, and it's not going to happen. And sure enough, several months later, they issue an order that said, we can't do anything about this. We don't have jurisdiction. He's now on the Supreme Court. He can't be touched. And then they appealed to a larger panel, as you obviously know, at the 10th Circuit, and they said, no, we can't do anything. He's a justice now. And there's another appeal coming up to what's known as the Judicial Conference Conduct Board, where the chief himself presides over all of this. But the whole thing is run by judges. And again, it would be hard to have it not run by judges for some separation of powers issues, but it does show the dilemma. And if you're trying to instill confidence in the system, it's that doesn't instill confidence. Yeah.
So that's why maybe we need one in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, at least to call attention to it, because sometimes even if it can't have really sharp teeth, just acknowledging that there could be a problem is a step. And one more question. Oh, is that okay? One.
I'm really concerned about his stand on the Voting Rights Act and the fact that he thinks there's no problem.
Right.
And I just wonder, do you think he's still of that mindset?
Okay, what the questioner was referring to was the chief's 2013 opinion in Shelby County versus Holder, where he took the lead to scale back an important provision of the 1965 Voting Rights Act and said, famous line about how things had changed in the South, no longer need what's commonly known as the pre-clearance provision.
Yeah.
That has to do with jurisdictions with a history of discrimination that had been required to get federal approval for any proposed election change. I don't think he has any regrets about that, and I'll tell you why. Since then, some voting measures that were enacted immediately after the 2013 ruling in North Carolina and Texas, for new voter ID requirements, new redistricting maps, have come up on a preliminary basis to the Supreme Court, and again, haven't been resolved on the merits, but the signals from the chief has been reinforcing his view that this is not something that still requires the level of federal involvement that had been there
Lord.
before. So
That's very sad for us.
that it? Is that? Yes, yes. Thank you all. Yes.